It's 10:02 and we are going to run all the way to 11:30. So let me just begin by welcoming everyone. So good morning and welcome to IDEA's webinar on the 2021 budget. How transparent will it be? So we know that the 2021 budget will be tabled by the government, by Perikatan Nasional on Friday, the 6th of November. This is coming up very soon in the next month. And it will be the first budget that the new PN government will be tabling. And even so, a very important one, because it is an unprecedented public health crisis in our midst. So in addition to being this important a moment for the fiscal and economic policy, it will be the first major test of the government's commitment to improving budget transparency. I'm very happy to welcome with me today our three esteemed panelists. So what I'll do is just introduce them first, and then later on when we start, we can go straight into having them speak. So the first panelist today is Ms. Suad Hassan. She's a researcher at the International Budget Partnership, IBP. And the International Budget Partnership is an international organization that promotes budget transparency around the world. IDEAS actually has been working very closely with the IBP over many years to conduct the country research for what it's called the Open Budget Survey. And I think Suad can share with you more about that. So Suad's joining us from Washington, DC at 10 p.m. at night. So thanks very much for sacrificing your late night for us. Next, we will then have YB Wong Chen, who is a member of parliament for Subang, and he will be commenting on the sustainability of the budget and the use of extra budgetary measures on the stimulus package and parliamentary oversight and the limitations of those parliamentary oversight mechanisms. So very glad to have you as well, YB. I know there's a lot of things happening in Parliament, or almost. And we have finally our third speaker, Jeffrey Pang, who is the chairman of MyPJ. MyPJ is a local community civil society organization that has done a lot of work. I mean, Jeffrey himself is very experienced with the local governance, and specifically he will talk about MyPJ's experiences in monitoring budget formulation and implementation at the local government level, specifically within the City Council of Petaling Jaya. So that really brings it down to the actual monitoring. We talk a lot about things, but what does it mean when we're actually monitoring the budget at the local level, and how can the public play a role? So before we actually begin, I'm going to share a couple of slides that will be able to give you an idea of how we contextualize everything together. So before I start, I'll introduce myself as well. So I'm Trisha Yeo. I'm the CEO of IDEAS, an independent public policy think tank based in Kuala Lumpur. We do work on a range of issues, and we do that by conducting independent research and public advocacy. So you will see on your screen a couple of slides and information. So this slide just shows you the different stimulus packages that were rolled out in the year 2020. So from March to September, we had 4 different instances of stimulus package. And I think it's important to note that the large amount that was announced on the 27th of March under the Prihatin, the large proportion actually was not direct fiscal injection, but it was non-fiscal. So it was calculated in terms of the loan moratorium and so on. But in short, there were 4 different packages from March, April, June, and September. And then, okay, so next slide just tells you where Malaysia sits internationally. So this is our most recent Open Budget Survey score. And there are 3 areas: transparency, public participation, and budget oversight. And our interim transparency score for this year would be 52 over 100. It's not very high, but you can actually see that in the next slide of how we perform. And you can see from this information that public participation is the one that we don't perform as highly on. So compared to other Westminster countries, there are 3 indicators, as I mentioned. So you can see again that public participation is the lowest, just slightly over India's score. And in terms of oversight as well, not doing so well, but transparency is not too bad. But compared to like New Zealand, Australia, United Kingdom, and Canada, their scores are much higher. And then finally, just giving you a picture of our proposed budget over the years. So this shows you from 2005 all the way to 2020, the most recent. And you can see also that the proportion of operating expenditure versus development expenditure, the OpEx proportion has grown quite significantly over the years. So I'm not going to analyze too much. I'm just going to stop there. And I would now like very pleased to from the International Budget Partnership to be our first speaker this morning. And Suat, you will have between 7 to 10 minutes, and each of you as well. And if I may ask anyone who already has the questions for any panelists, please go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box, and then later my colleague is going to help screen them for me. Go ahead, Suat, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just trying to expand the screen here. Here we go, as the slideshow. Can you see it now? Let me just take this out. Are you able to see it?
Yes, we do see it, Suat, but we see it also with your like next slide view.
Okay, let me just try again. So, apologies for that. Let me just try one more time. Does that work better? Is it for?
This is perfect.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to speak on this platform. My name is Fahad Hassan, as Trisha introduced. I am a program officer at IBP with the OBS team, and I will be working on Malaysia's questionnaire for the next round. Will be taking care of the Asia portfolio. I was not the program officer for Malaysia in the previous round. However, I have tried to update myself on the knowledge so far, and I'm obviously aware of methodology. That said, I want to really mention here, we at IBP and within the OBS team really value our partnership with ideas, and Uni has been a long-time researcher. We are so impressed by your commitment and the good quality of work, and we really look forward to engaging with you more. So with that, I will start with my presentation, and I want to mention that my presentation is also with a lot of screenshots of Malaysia's country summary, but I can sort of intertwine that with where global standing is, so that you have an idea of where Malaysia stands and what kind of information could be improved in the budget proposal, especially in the case of Malaysia, looking at the responses of the questionnaire. So starting with open budget survey and why are we looking at open budgets? Why is this important? I mean, we all understand that this is even more important during a crisis, because all governments, much like Malaysia, are responding to the crisis through fiscal policies. Malaysia, I understand, has also introduced multiple fiscal stimulus packages, and also international lending, as we all know, has become a huge issue now. And given that budgets are a reflection of government priorities, open budgets become that much more critical. They're critical to, especially to earning trust in these times. So citizens need to be informed about the fiscal decisions that a country is taking and the rationale behind those decisions as well. And, you know, there is international consensus now on transparency around fiscal stimulus, as well as the debt position and expenditure for the sake of tracking expenditures by the international community as well. We have heard IMF repeatedly say that do whatever it takes to handle the crisis, but keep the receipts. And we at IBP are saying, do whatever it takes to take care of the crisis, keep the receipts, but publish them too. As we have seen in many countries, CSOs are in fact helping governments track expenditures so that it actually reaches the beneficiaries. So with that, I want to just give a brief background on what is the Open Budget Survey. The Open Budget Survey measures budget transparency in the national budget process through one annual cycle, budget cycle. So we measure transparency through 8 key budget documents. Then this is what the score is based on. The aggregate score is based on the transparency of budget information. Then we also have 2 other pillars that don't go into the transparency score or the open budget index score, but are scored separately. And there are 18 indicators around public participation, opportunities to participate in the budget process, and 18 indicators on oversight by legislature and audit institution. So we already have seen a snapshot of this same screen where we see Malaysia's score of 47, which is not too bad, but there is a lot of room to improve. And this shows the heat map of the world, and the global average for the world is 45 out of 100. To give you context on what that means, we have divided, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, we have divided the scores into categories of information. So a score of 41 to 60, which is where Malaysia lies and the global average is, means that the country is providing limited information. Limited information that does not allow citizens to meaningfully engage with the government or in the budget process. As going by the indicators in the Open Budget Survey, a score of 61 and above is considered substantial information for citizens to meaningfully participate in the budget process. So our goal for all countries is to first aim for a score of 61 and above. How does Malaysia do in comparison to other countries? There are good examples in the region to learn from. There are very good examples. Philippines is one of the best performing countries in the region. Not to say that Malaysia is far off, we are close enough, but there is room to improve. Then the scope for improvement in Malaysia's budget proposal, going off of the indicators that are there in the most recent round of the survey. Just to note very quickly that of the 8 key budget documents, the budget proposal is the very main document that forms almost 50% of the score. Half of our indicators are on the budget proposal. So this slide is based on the information that I pulled from Malaysia's questionnaire and where there is room for improvement. One of the most important areas where Malaysia could improve is on information related to debt. And we know that this becomes all the more important during this crisis. Citizens have a right to know how their country is going to pay for the debt that is incurred during this time. And what does it mean for the long-term finances of the country? So in the Open Budget Survey, we ask questions not just around debt that was paid off in the previous years or debt service payments up to that point, but also projections for in the coming year on the principal and the interest rates, the range of interest rates, internal, domestic, as well as external loans. And if one looks at the questionnaire, there really is room for Malaysia to improve on their reporting of the debt for the coming year. Another area where Malaysia could really improve is reporting on the full financial situation. Beyond just the debt that is incurred, a country's entire fiscal situation can be assessed also by the assets and liabilities that are on the balance sheet, financial assets as well as non-financial assets. These, as recorded in our survey, are not reported in the budget documents. Then extra budgetary funds, again, quintessential to understanding a country's full fiscal situation. And that is something that should be included in addition to expenditures and revenues on the consolidated balance sheet. Again, something where we know that in Malaysia, there are non-financial corporations, and especially during this crisis, as shown on this slide, shared in the beginning, huge amounts have been transferred through extra budgetary funds. Often when it's done through off-budget measures, it completely goes unrecorded, and that is in some ways hurting the trust that could be built between citizens and the country at these times. We know that during a crisis, the more trust there is in the government, the more citizens are likely to listen to the government. So you see this link between not reporting or lack of transparency and listening on important public service messages like indications or information on what to do on health. So if there is greater trust, citizens are more likely to follow those instructions by the government. Then the third, within this whole gambit of debt and understanding the fiscal situation of a country, is fiscal risk. I apologize for the typo, the R is capital. And in fiscal risk, we are looking for expenditure arrears, contingent liabilities in the form of loan guarantees or whatever the country may have. Again, Malaysia does not score well on these, unfortunately. We also ask questions around sensitivity analysis, which is the effect on budget of possible changes in macroeconomic assumptions. What kind of assumptions are we talking about? Exactly the one that happened now. Something like oil shocks, as well as external crises that could lead to a real fall in revenue. Malaysia did not publish one, but I'm not sure whether there exists one or not. And lastly, we ask questions around the long-term sustainability of finances, and that information is also missing in Malaysia. Then quickly to go over the second area that is extremely relevant to the current crisis and would help from reporting in the budget proposal is information on policy proposals. We ask for impact of new policies on revenues and expenditures. Malaysia could improve in that. We score, it's graded scoring. We have A, B, C, D scores for all questions where A implies 100, which means there is perfect information. B is a score of 66, C is a score of 33, and D is a score of 0. So in Malaysia's case, when I say there's scope for improvement, it implies that most likely the country scores somewhere between a B or most likely a C. Then we ask questions around if the policies, if the new proposals are linked to long-term policies, and Malaysia does fairly well in that. Then we ask a question on what is the impact of these policies on impoverished and marginalized communities. This question is also extremely important, although just one indicator, very important during this crisis. We know that globally, World Bank is anticipating that almost 71 to 100 million people could be pushed into poverty, and almost all countries are facing this crisis. So again, you know, if there is scope for encouraging government to publish more information, this is one space where information could be improved in the reporting of documents. Then there is information on, I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the slides myself. So we are asking for information on debt, new policy proposals, extra budgetary funds, and yes, intergovernmental transfers. In this crisis especially, the assistance, immediate assistance needed was by frontline service delivery units, which in many countries happen to be delivered by subnational governments. Unfortunately, I'm not too aware as of now of the governance in Malaysia, but for instance, in the United States, this is a huge issue where intergovernmental transfers to states is one of the most contentious issues, but also one that requires most amount of transparency, because service delivery on health is a state issue. Here too, Malaysia could improve on the information provided. Lastly, one area where Malaysia does really well is on information on expenditures and revenues. So Malaysia does provide information by the kinds of classifications that we ask for: administrative, economic, functional, as well as programmatic, and categories of revenues. But we also ask for multi-year projections, as well as comparisons with previous years. And now this becomes very important because understandably, we want to know how, what the allocations are compared to previous years, given the crisis. Now, in the understanding of expenditures and revenues, while we understand that in Malaysia, the transparency on these is really scoring well, budget oversight in Malaysia scores poorly on the open budget survey. And we ask questions around legislators' authority over the budget process. So does the budget committee or any committee in the legislature review the budget proposal and submit recommendations to Ministry of Finance, executive, or to the legislature in general? Do they have authority to amend the legislature? Do they review in-year reports? And I understand, we've noticed that in the open budget survey, to some extent, this is a limitation of the Westminster system, parliamentary system. But nevertheless, Malaysia does score poorly. This does compound the problem during a crisis where decisions are taken rather immediately and put into action by the executive. So just to keep that in mind as well. Lastly, I just want to note here that IBP has issued a call to action. We started the survey in 2006, and what we have noted in over a decade of conducting these surveys on a biennial basis is that while there has been progress, it is really slow. And if we want the global average of the world to reach 61, which is meaningful information for citizens to engage in the budget process, it could take decades. The improvements are as low as just 2 or 3 points per year. So we've called on we have issued a call to action to all stakeholders, and we are really glad that IDEAS has joined it. And through this call, we are asking to publish information on how resources are generated, allocated, and spent. In terms of the open budget survey, this means that you score above 61. And on our part, we are willing to publish this information on our website if the government so wishes, to provide an example to citizens and to other countries in the region. With that, I end my presentation. Happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you. I hope I didn't go over, but thank you so much.
It was slightly, but it was very interesting, so I didn't want to stop you. But thank you so much, Suat, for your presentation. It definitely shows the importance of, I think what you try to emphasize is that as governments provide more information, this allows them to gain more public trust from the people. And this is a time where all governments around the world, I think, are hoping to gain that public trust, even as they grapple with the public health crisis. So on that note, actually, it's probably interesting to respond to a question that was asked about whether there's been any engagement with the government on the result of the survey, and if yes, what's the government response? So I think I should answer that on behalf of IDEAS. As I said from the beginning, we have been working closely with IBP on this research for many years now. And in the recent years, the answer is that yes, the government has actually been responsive, and they actually wanted to improve. So they looked at the scoring system and they said, okay, how is it that we can increase? Because we thought that we're doing so well already in the participation part of the 3 parts, and then that 1 part participation, they thought that they were doing very well. So in our engagements with them, they are keen to improve, and they're asking us, how can they do that? And the interim score, which is based on the 2020 budget proposal, already shows you that it's actually a higher score than the previous transparency score in 2019. So that does indicate, it's slow, but I think it's steadily, hopefully growing. Okay, I'm going to now pass the time to YB Wong Chen. So YB, you're a member of parliament and you've been doing a lot of work looking at budgets over the years. Can you please talk to us about some of the topics that we've hopefully asked you? And you can also feel free to respond to Suat, and feel free to respond to each other as panelists. All right, YB, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. Hello to Suat and also my good friend, Professor Pang. I've been asked to comment about 4 items, essentially. One, on the budget sustainability issue. Second is on the extra budgetary measures, where we're going to find the money in the age of COVID. And then the third one is on the parliamentary oversight of the budget, and the fourth on the limitation and how can we improve this kind of oversight. So let me just start with the first issue on the sustainability of the budget. Now, the federal budget is quite simple. It's a matter of revenue and expenditure. Revenue coming to government and what they spend on. Revenues are basically taxes, earnings from GLC, and in Malaysia, Petronas plays a big contribution to that. And then expenditure has 2 components. Roughly, you have OPEX, operating expenditure, and then development expenditure, DVEX. The concept of sustainability in Malaysia is based on a very simple principle. And that principle is the OPEX cannot, the operating expenditure cannot exceed the total government revenue, right? So for example, in the last 5 years or so, the Malaysian budget hovers around about 300 billion, for sake of simple explanation. Say it's about 300 billion budget a year, 250 will be allocated for operating expenditure, and 50 billion will be for development expenditure. And the total government revenue normally is around 250 billion as well. So sustainability in the mind of government means that the OPEX of 250 billion must not exceed the 250 billion of revenue tax collected. Yeah, so that's how they look at it, and that's how they think about the issue about sustainability. Now, for DVEX, development expenditure, the government is allowed to borrow, and it's the rationale comes from the idea that if we spend money on development, in theory, these development programs like building bridges and on capacity even for productivity, all this will spur the economy to grow, and future revenue should develop from this spending. Yeah, but the reality, of course, is very different. We face challenges when it comes to DVEX in particular, in corruption issues, wastage, bad policy, not thinking through the process, bad implementation of these development projects. And sometimes, like what Suat pointed out, we use the wrong mechanisms, such as pushing projects, lopsided privatization concessions, and more scary is these projects are generally off budget, opaque, unaccountable, and deemed official secret, some of them. Okay, so budget sustainability is understood in those very simple terms. There's never been an issue of trying to even balance the budget, and God forbid getting a surplus, right? The last surplus, I suppose, was when my boss, Anwar Ibrahim, was the Minister of Finance in 1997. Okay, so since 97 until now, this is the overriding issue about sustainability and what the concept of sustainability means in Malaysian fiscal policy. Now we come to the issue of the tough fiscal challenges we face from the pandemic. The second issue, extra budgetary measures in the age of COVID. We don't have any choice. Yeah, we have to suspend the sustainability rule of the OPEX not exceeding government revenue. Otherwise, you will see massive operating expenditure cuts and even possible civil service layoffs, right? So this situation that we're in at the moment, in theory, should encourage, in fact, a fight against corruption, wastage, and provide external impetus to revamp the entire procurement system and practices. But, the idea is very simple. Since the government has no extra silly money lying around, there should be no space for corruption. That is at least in theory. Okay? The practice and implementation remains to be seen. And the key issue is, how do you find the extra budgetary money? There are broadly 2 options. One is quantitative easing, or second is to issue more government securities. Now the government can take a third path, which is to sell assets, asset sale. Yeah, but that's going to be very difficult politically. and is going to be mired in allegations of corruption, all that, and it will not help in terms of raising the billions that we need. You know, you can sell 5 GLC or land or whatever and raise 2-3 billion. That's not going to make a tremendous impact. So basically, it just boils down to 2 options. Now, we can go down the monetary policy of quantitative easing, but in my view, it's not an option because we're going to go into untested waters on that front. Yeah, and we risk hyperinflation. You know, QE will also shock the currency, the Malaysian currency, right? And affect the import-export costs, making manufacturing difficult to sustain and to predict. In other words, it would do probably more damage than good. Now, I've spoken to some economists. I spoke to Danny Kwa about 2 months ago. I think there's a general agreement that for a small country and we don't have a currency that's globally accepted, QE is really not an option. So the only remaining option is a fiscal policy solution of issuing more government bonds and sukuks. Clearly the lesser of 2 evils, and we do have a history of issuing 50 billion every year for the last 10, 20 years, right? So I think in this round, we need to raise about 100 billion. Normally we raise 50 billion a year. We will probably need an additional 50 billion. But again, as Suat pointed out, fiscal estimation is a big problem. I'm estimating a shortfall between 50 to 70 billion next year in revenue. But if the revenue drops further and oil prices turn out to be low and constantly low, then we're going to have a problem with income tax revenue crash as well. If corporations close, they have no profits to report, they're not going to pay income tax. I think we could even see a situation where we need to raise about 150 billion of bonds next year. Yeah. Therefore, this then increases the risk of us facing a ratings downgrade, a sovereign rating downgrade. Now, having said that the scenario where it's quite negative, we can manage all this because the tool that we usually use to raise government bonds is really the EPF. It's the buyer of the last resort. And we need not have to invite foreign buyers, which would then open up our sovereign rating issues. Yeah, and keep it internal. Because EPF does have the capacity to absorb 150 billion of bonds. But the depositors of EPF, that's all of us here, we have to be, you know, we have to see the question whether we're going to be happy or not, and whether we can get the returns, and whether this financial operation tool that the government uses is fair or not. Yeah? Okay, now let me just quickly go into the Parliament oversight issue, the third point. Now, approving the budget is, of course, one of the 3 key jobs of a member of Parliament. The other 2 being legislating, going to Parliament to legislate and pass laws, and also policy making, driving it through the committee system. Yeah. Even this third job, approving the budget every year in October, November, we do very little debate on the issue. Yeah. I get about 30 minutes of debate time, if I'm lucky. If I'm lower down on the rank, then I get 10 minutes, 20 minutes, right? So we get a period of 2 to 3 weeks where the members of Parliament, 160 non-executive members of Parliament, have to debate this in October, November every year. And the quality of these debates, you can watch it yourself. You know, overall, it's not great. The answers from the ministers are also not good. They either they don't know or they just not giving you a straight answer. So in that sense, the debates are not a very effective mechanism for oversight. Yeah. So we'd have to depend on committees. And that one committee that I used to be a member of, the Public Accounts Committee, is the only committee in Parliament that has a proper secretariat and proper resources, you know. But the PAC only has powers to investigate the issue of the budget after it has happened or misspent or wastage. You know, to pardon my French, but after the shit has hit the fan, you can't really do much. They're not involved in the budget making process. So, you know, when Perikatan became the government for 22 months, there was a lot of push to say, look, we need to rectify this situation. Therefore, the speaker rightly created some select committees, you know, and in particular, he created the select committee on the budget. Yeah, I'm not part of that committee, but clearly, even from the structure itself, you can see that committee is clearly not going to be effective. How can a committee of 7 MPs monitor 20 to 25 ministers, you know, and the budget of 300 billion? So it's not possible. Creating a select committee on the budget is not going to help, right? So then comes my last point, and I will wrap it up by suggesting what are the improvements we can do for parliamentary oversight. The answer is not very difficult. It's just you have to tweak the existing committee system. You're going to find resources for the committee. You got to give them the secretariat, a proper one, right? So I would definitely suggest we close down the budget committee straight away. rebrand it as a finance committee with bigger memberships of say about 11 to 14 MPs, right? Rebrand it and give them more white powers, right? Finance committee. Now, then you limit their job when it comes to the budget to the big picture issue regarding taxes, OPEX, DVEX, economic outlooks, right? And then, on the other hand, you quickly form the committees to be all ministerial committees. So these committees would then supplement the work of the new finance committee by focusing on the detailed budgets of every individual ministries. Yeah. So I'm the current chairman of the International Relations and Trade Committee. I look after MOFA and MITI. What I wanted to do, and because all committees have been suspended since the MCO until now, so there's nothing I can do. But what I had intended to do early on, and I spoke to the speaker about this, is to give me the powers to question the budget of MITI and MOFA. So I'll do the work for the finance committee, right? I can go and ask them as early as the second quarter and the third quarter of that particular year. Ask the ministers, MOFA ministry and MITI, what are their budget plans? Do they match the policies they talk about, right? Are they carrying out good procurement policies? What are these massive contracts that you have? Can you explain? Now, if I get to do that, I do the budgetary, work, the legwork for the finance committee, then it's the perfect system. Then I will then make recommendations to the finance, to the ministers themselves and say, look, this is our recommendation. We've looked at your budget. We think that it can be improved on this front. Can you revamp your procurement system, so on and so forth? And then we write a final report to the finance committee that will enable the finance committee of 11, 14 MPs to look at the big picture. Yeah, taxes, OPEX, DVEX, economic outlook. So in summary, the solutions are there. They're always available. It's not difficult. It can be done, but you need, and it's always been, whether it's under BN or Pakatan Harapan or whoever, whichever prime minister, it's always been an issue about political will to implement these solutions. That's it. I'll be happy to answer more questions later. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Raibi. That's a very clear picture of Malaysia itself. The select committees were implemented by the previous speaker. I think see what the new speaker does. I think when Parliament opens, then we'll see whether there are new select committees, there are, budget-related, finance-related ones as well. Okay, so I think Jeffrey, you are last but not least. Jeffrey Pang from MyPJ. You can share more about the local governance perspective.
Hi, greetings to my esteemed panelists, Wabi Wong Chen and Swat Hassan. And thank you so much, Tricia, for inviting me to share. Yeah, I'd like to share about a ground zero perspective of how we get things done on the local council level. This actually is a 10-year case study. We have been working on our local council, city council, for over 10 years on this matter. So we have a federal, and from the federal, we've got 13 states plus 3 federal territories, all doing budgets. And after that, we have got a whole mess of 154 local councils. So of course, today we are talking about the federal budget. It has got nationwide implications. The strategy that is decided on by the leaders there will have a great impact on us on the ground. Then on the more local level, the statewide implications are generated from the way the state plan the budget. And lastly, with the local council, and this will directly affect the people. So I just want to highlight the importance of public participation and the feedback. Not only are we talking about the trust feature, where the government have more trust from the people if they're transparent, but right now it is more of a very fluid situation that we're in. With IR 4 and also the COVID, you see that paradigms are shifting all the time. If the policymakers at the top make a wrong assumption all of us at the bottom will suffer. On the state level, they also need to have constant feedback. In fact, right now, we would like to have real-time feedback so that we can make real-time decisions. You know? So I think at the end of the day, the International Budget Partnership have set down a set of ideals that we should all try to follow so that we can be more transparent. It will trickle all the way down to the local council. It will affect the budget creation portion and the budget monitoring portion. Both of them are important. But unlike a business where we budget for survival, the government is supposed to budget for the well-being of the people. But then again, even sometimes this objective is lost in the process of bureaucracy. So as you have seen, we are nearly at the bottom there. And how does at the federal level, how does it look from the local council and state level? So over here, very directly, there are some of these things that are put in the budget. And it's a budget sequence actually, but localized to a local authority context and for the people. The pre-budget statement, we don't get a list of the assumptions. We do not have even a budget team for the year. So, and how do they assume to get things done? So the other thing is the executive budget proposal. And this is a bit of concern. In every council, we've got 24 councillors. But every year for the last 10 years, they're given inadequate time to actually browse through the information. And the information itself is presented in a way that unless you're an accountant, you wouldn't know how to ask. You just be swimming in the darkness there. So, of course, earlier years, when we started, all the councillors get their figures, a big manual, and then they have a week now to go through it. And after some time, when we start to inquire for more and more information, and they now limited only the finance committee to get the budget draft figures ahead of time. This year was really bad. I think the public know the figures before the councillors. So after the public meeting, then the councillors get their figures. A few days later, they have to endorse it. So there's always a pressure of time to force through a budget. So for citizens' budget, something simpler way that we can understand. We don't get any feedback. Not even the councillors get it. And of course, quarterly reports are also non-existent. They don't give it things like that. And mid-year review, we have been fighting for that. And in 2012, they did promise that they will give us a mid-year review. But after that, when the change of mayor, all this was swept under the carpet. And then about 3 or 4 mayors ago, they used to actually publish an annual qualitative report. And this is supposed to be not only the budgeted figures, but also in description and qualitative terms, how impactful it was. But after about 7-8 years ago, this has been stopped as well. The audit report is the only one in yellow, which means that it is being done. That is because it is a statutory requirement for them to be audited. But if you look at it being published on the website, it should be quite obvious that once you get it audited, you put it onto the website. But audit reports constantly get missing. So even for this year, when we are about to go for the public dialogue, we look it up, and the year 2017 and 2018 and 2019 is missing. All right. So we have to get a councillor to actually request for it to be put back onto the web. So our main concern here is this. All this time, no matter how much we talk about zero-based budgeting, they are doing it on incremental budgeting. So things have still not changed. We do not have a budget calendar, which means that they are able to push through things quite fast, and force you to actually endorse it without giving it a proper review. For public discussion, of course, this is something, it's a PR exercise that is boasted by many of the local councils, and some of the local councils don't even hold public discussion. But when they hold it, there's no meaningful figures presented. And they give you incomplete information, so you cannot see the big picture. And also they are not inclusive. They exclude the B40. So when we raise up all these things, there was one particular public discussion that was held on a Sunday. After that, they reverted back to on the weekdays when the marginalized community cannot come. So the other thing is about budget monitoring. They always discuss about the budget figures and all, a lot of discussion, but subsequent to that, how are they spending the money? And we found that normally it's around September, they spend about 65 to 70% of their budget, or even lower than that, 60%. So there's always a rush to spend towards the end of the year. So we have got some of the things that we are not too happy about, the Christmas shopping and all. So the only thing that we can rely on is audited accounts, which we have compiled all the years as we go through. And at certain years, we found that the cash is really getting a lot. In other words, the budgeted figures that they talk about was actually not spent. So a lot of the cash, and making them very liquid. At one time, they have cash holdings of nearly $500 million there. And we asked for negative budget, spend it on the people. No, you're not supposed to save it. But eventually, I think they have started spending. But unfortunately, we do not know how they spend it. And now they say that, no, they don't have very much reserves already. So this is 2016. We are asking for the same thing, be transparent and accountable. And we also use the term wang kita, hak kita, which means that it's our money, it's our right to know what you're doing. So this is actually taken from Penang, one of the campaigns that we had. We have also taken it up to the federal level. We saw the KPKD minister, and we were asking and pushing for participatory budgeting, and very closely related to this local council election as well. So this is one of the examples of PJ budget meeting, where they get you into a circle, and what they will do is they'll give an opening speech, and then after that say, what would you like to see in a green city? What would you like to see in a safe city? So people gather around and they talk a lot of things. We even write down our suggestions, but after that, that's the end. We don't even hear whether our suggestions are received or not. So right now we see that all these public dialogues for half a day is really not structural enough. But we did make some success. One of the mayors that before he left gave a budget of $3 million for participatory budgeting. That means the residents can pitch and say what would they like to be implemented that will help the city. But eventually, the requirements were quite stringent. It discouraged a lot of people. People didn't apply for it. Then they cut it down to 1 million. And now they are cutting it down to 750,000. So this is a change of concept that's needed. To encourage participatory budgeting, you have to capacity build the people, not being a guardian of how much you can give, and then when you cannot meet the requirements, then they are more than happy saying that no, we have very strong requirements.
Jeffrey, can you start to wrap up?
Yes, okay. These are last few slides. So this is stop pinching pennies. We need more transparency and better public participation. But the budget monitoring committee is important. And this has been said many times already. And then if you look at it all through the years, we'll be asking for budget monitoring committee even in 2012. Finally, this is a budget that is actually done on participatory budgeting by one of the state representatives. She collected a full compilation, gave it to the city council. Unfortunately, it was not incorporated. So this is the status. When you look at budgeting, the part very pronounced is people don't know what is it all about. This is the average, and most people don't know what is the budgeting process. So I think this is the last very important slide. What we are not getting and achieving is the lack of political will. When government change before and after being voted in, once they are voted in, then it's a bit inconvenient to be too open. The other thing is there's a lack of freedom of information and open data. The appointed councillors, we have 3 political parties, 3 factions. and they are not united in going. What they work on is ad hoc complaints rather than setting up structures and systems. So we are not lacking in ideals. No? Local business practices, their standard of budgeting is good enough to actually put in, but there's just lack of political will. So I think there's lack of citizenship education, and the real responsibility should be the state government through the EXCO for local government should implement and achieve transparency in budget working through the mayor. More stringent guidelines should be put in. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for telling us really what is happening on the ground and how people can contribute meaningfully. And I can see from the photos that you have been very active as well. I have a quick question, actually. The picture that you took where you had a coalition, the local governance coalition meeting the minister, was that under the previous administration or the current administration?
Yeah, before the Sheraton move.
Before the change in government, okay.
Yes, correct.
I believe that she has been and still is one of the few champions of local government elections, and I wonder whether that is still the case now under the current government. Do you know what her inclination is at the moment, Jeffrey?
I think she attempted to do it, but the PN government says no.
I see. Okay.
A firm no. So then she had to back off.
Okay. All right. So I think now we can thank you to all the panelists for sharing your wonderful views. We have more than half an hour now to get into the Q&A. So I think what we can do is I'm going to field the questions that are coming in both from the chat and the Q&A so that it relieves the panelists of having to look through them. So I will direct the questions, and if anybody else would like to respond as well, I would just get you to feel free. So we have a question directed to, I think, more appropriately, YB Wong Chen. So the statement is actually that the Malaysian bonds have been very much downrated by FTSE, and it will not be fruitful on the long term until and otherwise the interest rates are hiked. This is really in relation to your proposal earlier about the need for Malaysia to issue like double the amount of bonds and sukuk that it has been over the last years, and using that as a way to finance the current, COVID crisis and other economic problems that we're facing. What do you think about that?
Okay, yeah, well, this is a situation where you have no choice. You do have to issue bonds. Now, as I said earlier, you can use the financial oppression tool, which is to force EPF to buy. Therefore, you can try to manage the exposure to external bondholders. This is a bit of a magic trick. It has to be done. Of course, they don't do it openly. This has to be done through some careful planning. It's just a situation where there's no choice at all. And this is a situation that involves every country in the world, right? One way or another, of course, the richer countries like US, UK, Japan, they could go into QE. They just print money, right? Where they run monetary policies. But for smaller countries, no choice. And I think the rating agencies do understand that this is a need to be done. And hopefully, they will not look at this period, this COVID-19 period, which could be 1 or another 2 years to go, to be a black spot for most of these countries that have to issue more bonds. So I don't think there could be a suspension of, or at least, well, they will try not to downgrade you. And I think that's the best option we can get. But of course, if we really focus on eliminating wastage, corruption, that kind of thing, we can borrow less. You can probably eliminate 10, 20 billion at best from this kind of thing, but you still need to borrow, in my estimation, 80 billion at least for next year.
Thanks, Wong Chen. Actually, I'm also interested in this. So, I think we know that a lot of our revenues come from oil and gas, and we know that oil and gas, Petronas performance has not been doing very well recently. So, in light of that, and then of course your solution is kind of bonds and sukuk, I'm just wondering what your own personal opinion is about GST. And I know that it was scrapped during the Pakatan Harapan administration. I haven't heard anything solid about the current administration's position on it. But how do you feel about the current situation, given the fact that government will be facing fiscal squeeze, like whichever government is in place, right? It will be grappling with this problem.
My personal view is I do support the GST. I mean, this is very strange to hear, but I gave a speech, I think last year or 2 years ago in my budget speech, that certain Pakatan leaders insisted on going to scrap the GST. Back then, I wrote a policy paper for 3%, but I have to carry out, the will of the big bosses, right? So if you ask my personal view, I think the GST, we don't have the luxury of foresight, okay? But we know for certain GSTs is consumption tax is more stable and less likely to be hit by fluctuations in economic condition, because people still need to eat, they still need to consume. I don't think the government will be going on the GST, and even if we take over, it's going to be a big political issue, whether we will bring it back or not. But from my personal point of view, from an economic, academic point of view, clearly we do need some form of GST. The issue about GST is really about keeping the introduction low and then fixing a real time frame for it, so that the consumers and also the manufacturers can plan ahead. So the right thing to do was really to bring it down to 3% and plan it for, say, lock it in for 5 to 7 years, fixed, no reshuffling of GST next week or increasing next year, so that people can plan ahead. Then over time, people will understand the requirement for GST, and every cycle of every 7 to 10 years, when there's a downturn, the GST becomes a crucial point for government revenue to stabilize the economy. I think that's the way forward. But again, it's all up to the political masters and what they do. And I think you're going to have a lack of political will on this issue as well.
Okay, thanks for sharing your views. I think what's important, if you kind of zoom out in the bigger picture, is not just the government solution to all this, but how they manage the public expectation. And this is where the transparency element comes in. There should be stability and predictability from all sectors, right? So the private sector, citizens, all need to know what's going to happen. A lot of information needs to be provided to the people. So this is where I want to move into the question surrounding public participation. So maybe Suat and even Jeffrey can jump in here as well. So the question is, what does it take for the government to start proper public consultation? Do we need to legislate public consultation process by the government? Maybe Suat.
Suat.
Thank you, Trisha. Before that, I just want to make a point that I forgot to mention, but may be beneficial to the viewers here, is that the Open Budget Survey and some of the indicators that I mentioned where Malaysia could improve, the indicators in the survey are based on international best practice standards developed by international multilateral organizations like IMF, World Bank, OECD. And that's what the survey is based on. And that's what allows it for a cross-country global comparison. Thank you. So to your question about public participation, while there is no, peer-reviewed study on this, anecdotally, I can definitely say that much like what other colleagues have mentioned here, political will is a really good starting point for public participation. If it is in legislation, it most definitely helps, because then there is the backing of the institution and for civil servants to carry out that activity and exercise, as opposed to it being just a burden. I mean, sometimes it really comes down to the day-to-day job of people to do and carry out these practices more meaningfully. One of the things that we notice in our survey is that while most of the countries do have some kind of participation, it could be through focus groups, as I understand is the case, or through pre-budget submissions, or just a public council, a small committee that is formed. Most of these are not meaningful. And by meaningful, we mean sometimes there is really very little room for influence even before the process has started. So it ends up being a checkmark activity. And often in some countries where even though participation is legislated, citizens are sort of dismayed by the experience over the years, because their feedback loop is not closed. The decisions have already been made. The timing of the participation is too late. And lastly, one thing that IBP looks for is inclusive participation, giving a voice to those who otherwise do not get a voice at the table. So I think this is also one aspect that is extremely important for public participation that countries are carrying out. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Jeffrey, do you have any views on this?
Yes. I think definitely if the government, whether state or federal, support public participation by first of all implementing freedom of information, that we can extract information from people. Selangor have actually done that, but they have not promoted it aggressively, and they have not actually tried to educate the citizens of their rights on public participation and participatory budgeting. So if they do it, then I think the critical mass would begin to understand it. But in reality, I think it might be a bit difficult because there is a problem with politicians that are in power and also the bureaucrats that are handling the day-to-day matters. So there's sometimes, like I've said earlier on, when even participatory budgeting has been compiled, they will not implement it. And there's nothing that the politician can do. So we see that because of this problem, we see a lot of councillors actually trying to be very pally with the bureaucrats so that they would do the work. But that destroyed the system completely. So all the time they've got to start being nice to the people there. So I think the only way of getting transparency in budget now is for the NGOs to educate all the people, the critical mass, until the government step in and do their part to educate.
Okay, so kind of like ground up, bottom up approaches, right? Because the demand needs to be there. I mean, I think one thing I've heard as well from government side or even politicians is that, oh, we made the information available transparently, but nobody is downloading it. But I mean, I think that's sometimes like a misnomer. I mean, that's a false kind of answer, because that should be information available by default. And it's up to, as you said, NGOs and CSOs like us to also drive the demand from the bottom. Wong Chen, I see that you have something to say as well.
Yeah, just let me just add a bit. It's true that most people are not, I mean, the public, the overall public is not going to be like 99% interested in this matter. You will have about 1% of the population that are truly committed to this issue, and that the job of the government is to fully engage transparency with this 1%, because they represent for the bigger picture. I just want to add that it must be legislated, and there must be an actual body actively doing this kind of thing, promoting it. And most important, the government's got to commit resources. I saw Jeffrey Pang's 3 million commitments dwindle down to 25%, 750,000 within 3 years. That's crazy. I mean, you can't, politicians get away with this kind of thing all the time. But if we don't create the structure, like our committee system, right? We can have committees, but we don't have money to run the committees. So it's always about resources and policies. But it has to be with a proper secretariat. The actual legwork has to be done. You can't expect the MP or the ADON or the councillor to do most of these things. You need a CEO, you need the finance department, you need the HR department, you need a team of 10, 20 people to actually push these kind of issues administratively. Yeah.
Right. Wong Chen, since we're speaking right now on public feedback, right? Do you have your own any experience or initiatives in collecting public feedback for the budget within your constituency?
No, unfortunately no, because we don't deal with local government. But in our own office, we are pioneering every 6 months reporting what I spend on. How I spend my office expenditure, what I do regarding the community expenditure. And then at the end of the year, we get a professional accountant to look at it, and then we actually publish that as well. So we do both a half year and then a final year thing. I think that's the important thing, to start people to understand that we are fully accountable and that we have to be accountable to the people on the money.
Okay, but that's not the practice of all the MPs though, right? It's just you.
Well, I don't know what the other MPs are doing, but we at least, you know, we try to do our bit. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We have a set of questions now that are all related to COVID-19. So I think this is, you know, the very current issue that we are, you know, grappling with. So there is a question about okay, what are the experiences of other countries on extra oversight measures during COVID-19, especially on debt? So I don't know, so maybe, you know, we've been talking a lot about Malaysia, but do you have examples from other countries? Like, what are the best practices? Have they been really transparent about how much they're spending? So that's one set of questions on the oversight measures. But another set of questions also related to COVID-19 is also regarding massive layoffs. So there's been massive layoffs during COVID. Have there been, you know, what's your experience of the Malaysian wage subsidy program, Wong Chen or Jeffrey? And also, are there other countries' experiences on the wage subsidies programs? Like, do other governments do that? Can citizens actually contribute to help within the citizen? I think we've seen a lot of that, right? A lot of private initiatives talking about that. So yeah, maybe you can address those sets of COVID-19 related questions first. Anyone, please feel free. Suad, first, maybe you can talk about the experience of other countries.
Sure. Thank you. If I could for a second go back to the previous issue of Freedom of Information Act. Frankly, I'm surprised that Malaysia doesn't have a Freedom of Information Act, and perhaps it may be worth looking into India as a case study where, again, you know, as Mr. Chen said, really a very small percentage of citizen warriors lobbied and advocated for freedom of information to be passed as an act. And really the whole country is benefiting from that tremendously. And to the other question about transparency and the links with public participation, absolutely, transparency in and of itself has never led to greater accountability, but accountability, transparency, and spaces for participation lead to greater accountability. And in this, civil society space plays a really important role, and to make sure that their voice is left free and not curbed and suppressed. To the other question about oversight measures, we did not collect any examples of oversight good practices in countries, but it really goes down to the laws in the country and the power of the executive. So one of the questions we ask in the open budget survey is, how much does the executive have the authority to amend the budget mid-year and to make transfers without the approval of the parliament? And yeah, so I'm not sure how Malaysia performs on that indicator, but countries like New Zealand have really strong legislative processes, and including United States. And I know that fiscal stimulus bills were debated rather quickly and at length, but no small amount was also transferred without approval from the legislature. And sometimes that can be a problem in itself because you don't get the legislature to agree, but there is very strong oversight from legislature. In terms of tracking, many good examples, interesting, fascinating examples from the world. I'm thinking South Africa, Chile, Argentina, all of these, Mexico, all of these countries have done extremely well in publishing real-time data at the programmatic level on expenditures related to COVID-19, as well as fiscal stimulus and the supplementary budget. In countries like Nigeria, and I believe in Chile also, civil society organizations have stepped up to use that data and present it in a user-friendly way, or to document procurement data, especially that related to health facilities, and track it and make sure that the funds are actually reaching the beneficiaries. I believe our neighbors in Indonesia have also done something similar. I can't recall right now what exactly the practice is, but happy to share it if that is of interest to the group. So yes, lots of innovative real-time tracking of COVID-related expenditures.
Thank you so much, Suat. I mean, that's really great because Ideas is actually most likely going to start a project where we track the stimulus packages throughout that have been presented throughout the year, and as well as what's happening next. And it would be really fascinating for us to look at the examples, as you say, CSOs working in Chile and Nigeria, Mexico, and so on how they have presented it. And then we can like emulate some of their good examples. Anyone wants to respond to the massive layoff issue wage subsidy programs?
Okay, can I just say that my office, we do superficially, I mean, we can't do a lot of work, but we do superficially track some of the ASEAN countries on their budget approach, right? So in Indonesia, for instance, they are struggling to raise money. Their tax system isn't great anyway to start with, right? So these countries like Indonesia, Cambodia, they have been, balancing their budget, so to speak, by pursuing more development, asset sale, opening up more land, and so on and so forth, right? Singapore, of course, is the other one that's on the far extreme where they got surplus. So they've been really comfortable. They just, use their surplus, dip into their surplus savings, and try to do this COVID-19 thing. Now, to the issue about unemployment or wage support, that really depends on the approach. First, whether these countries have money or not. Most of them don't, so they can't do wage support, right? Malaysia is in a situation where we can do some, but we don't do a lot because we don't have a lot of money. So we do a support level of about 25% on average, right? In Singapore, they go up to about, if I'm correct, about 50%. In more developed countries like Norway, Netherlands, we look at 90%, 70 to 90%. Now, the foundation of this, whether we want to support wages or not, depends on what economic system we believe. Most of us are shifting back towards Keynesian economics. So we believe that the foundation of a stable economy has to be based on strong employment. And that's the point. We're trying to do our best to pump there. Whether the Malaysian one is effective or not remains to be seen, because it's a combination of moratorium about the bank. It's a combination of what the COVID-19 spread is like, which in Malaysian terms, relative to the world, is quite contained, even though the sudden surge recently. Yeah, so it's hard to say. But I to be very fair to the Perikatan National Government, I don't think they've done a terrible job. Maybe the ministers are not performing, but at least the civil servants, the people in MOF doing the bread and butter issues, I think they know what's really going on. And with the limitations of money that we have, they are doing a decent enough job. I would think so. But we would have preferred the Minister of Finance to stop acting like he's a banker, yeah, and stop taking the position of banks and actually lead on the issue of moratorium. You can't have, saying the banks can do whatever they want, right? It's his job and responsibility to implement policies on moratorium on sectorial basis, on poor people's basis, right? So, things like that should be done. If loans are below 20,000, maybe a blanket moratorium on that because poor people only borrow small amounts, right? Those kind of things need to be refined better. Yeah, so that's what I think broadly. A few months ago, we thought it's going to be very bad. Then it got better. Now it looks very bad again. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think policy making should be reactive to some extent, and also should be driven by data as they develop. So some flexibility and commitment to lead. That's the point, not to surrender your rights and leadership to the private sector.
All right, thank you very much, YB. Jeffrey, you had
Yes.
something?
Yeah, I'd like to contribute on this as well. Actually, it goes beyond budget. During the last COVID, there was a lot of discoordination when people started working in silos. And COVID-19 really showed how bad it is when people work in silos. When the Kebajikan, that means the welfare ministry, was supposed to take over all the coordination, it was a real mess. All right. So I think resilience and all should be built into the budgets now, whereby people begin to work in the value chain. For us, we were quite lucky because we built up our value chain before the COVID-19. So even from the home, we can coordinate food aid directly to our affected residents. But right now, it is quite difficult if we don't build up resilience before the next pandemic. And the other thing is also there must be a change of mindset. The budgets must start to align with the new requirements of IR4. Creating jobs may not be that feasible, but creating entrepreneurs may be more something to go with. Later on, all the big amount of jobs like Grab Taxi and Panda Food and all will all disappear. So how do we actually plan for that? So I think some investment has to be made now on that.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff. We can hear your dog barking, so there must be someone in there. Okay, the last set of questions is about going back to the budget, right? So we've talked a bit about like COVID-19, and of course it's inescapable. I mean, that's the reality that we're all facing. So there's questions about, okay, how do we ensure the sustainability of federal budget planning and implementation irrespective of the government of the day? And it's related to that as well, spending towards the end of the year. I think Jeffrey raised that, right? Like a Christmas shopping kind of budget when they find out that they haven't spent enough. So, okay, now, spend as much as you can. I think it's not just related to local councils. I think state and federal governments also experience that. So why does it happen and what can be done? Again, final question, again, related to budget planning. So during the current unprecedented economic situation, it's ideal to have a budget pre-planned for a year, but with a review after a 3-month period. Do you have any comments on that? So, we have no idea what's going to happen in the next year or the next couple of years, even whether COVID is going to continue. We don't know about the availability of the vaccine. So, thinking about budget planning and the traditional route of budget planning, how do we manage the planning process as well as deal with it in a transparent and accountable manner? I mean, it is very tough. I can imagine governments around the world are struggling with this. But how do we balance those priorities? Anybody wants to respond? This is the last set of questions. So, but I'll give you a chance to wrap up just with a minute or so at the very end. Okay, YB.
Okay, I'll start. Okay, let's start with the second question because the first question is a bit too broad. Whether we should be pre-planning the budget properly, the government does actually start planning the budget as early as March for the coming year. So they do spend about, about 6 months looking at the budget because they have to finalize the budget more or less by September and then table it in traditionally in October. This year is going to be tabled in November, right? So they do have a pre-planning budget. The question is whether we should get involved. The opposition or members of the committee should get involved in those kind of things. Yes, absolutely. Whether the public should get involved or not, I think it's going to be very difficult to manage now because most people are not interested in the budget, as I pointed out earlier. 1% or 0.1% of the elite academic inclined people will look into this kind of thing. Right? Now, whether they need a 3 months review or not, I think generally you don't because a lot of people don't know. In actual fact, only 16 or less than 20% of the budget is discretionary in that sense. Like development spending is discretionary. Yeah, 80% of the budget, the bulk of the budget is already fixed. You got wages to pay 70 billion a year. You got to pay the interest rate 35 billion a year. You got pensions to pay 25 billion. All these are fixed. You know that procurement can't run, it has to be like 30, 40 billion a year. So many of these budget elements are fixed. The discretion element is 20% and mostly in the area of procurement and the area of development expenditure. Now, we can check those two things very easily. Procurement, we just have to force the government to revamp the entire thing into proper open tender, right? Open tender doesn't mean that you just open the tender up. The government has to write its own RFP. You cannot say, I tender apples, you tender oranges, there's an open tender process. So just getting that proper system in place, and this is not rocket science, everybody does it. There are like banks who does it, organizations who does it. All you have to do is adopt them. Okay, so if you trigger the procurement policy correctly, you could eliminate down the discretionary element down to maybe 10%. Yeah. Now, then what about the big development projects? That 10%, all those funny things that the ministers like to do, big projects, mega projects, go and have public hearing on those, whether they can justify building the ECRL at this kind of cost. All those needs to come in early. So if you don't do those elements right, you don't have to, put in band-aids like revisiting the budget 3 months later and so on and so forth is not necessary. The red tape of government and bureaucracy is such that you can't really do much more other than try to preempt all this early on through policy on procurement and also to engage on the mega projects. As I said, 80% of the budget is standard. You can allow the auditors, the Auditor General come in to ensure that this 80% is actually spent well. Yeah. Overall, the budget is always about economic growth. If you don't grow the economy, you can't get revenue. You can't get revenue, you can't spend. As simple as that. Yeah. So government must spend some amount of money thinking of how to stimulate the economy, go into, whether it's IR 4.0 or go into value chain development, all this kind of thing. Those are the crucial elements that we have to focus on. Cutting corruption and wastage can help, but it's more important to grow the economy so that the wastage and corruption can more or less be absorbed. I'm not I'm not promoting corruption. I'm just saying that at the bottom line, these kind of things can be tolerated without busting the entire government. Yeah, of course we have to fight corruption, but growing the economy is a much bigger issue. Thank you.
All right, thank you, YB. Anybody else to add?
I can speak on that. You can plan for the budget, but the implementation of it is something else. No, we don't get a chance to see how it's implemented. I remember an instance where the city council planned to buy extra incinerators for burning bodies and all, right? So they budget for it, they implemented it. Subsequently, we found that they don't have enough electricity to power that, and it wasn't used at all. So that was a classic case. It came out in the papers. Beyond that, there's another hall in Bandar Utama that installed the aircon, found again that they don't have enough electricity. So how can you complete a tender without completing all this? So I find that there's a failure in corporate governance. And right now we should bring in public governance, and the politicians in power now should facilitate the public now to set up all this mechanism. So as this public mechanism comes in, then you find that the budgeting will become more precise, and also the spending and oversight become more precise.
All right, thanks very much. I mean, yeah, the conversation has also moved to procurement, which we do quite a lot of research on as well. But just a comment on the pre-planning, I think we've done the research, and we do know that the government has multi-year expenditure framework where they plan for expenditures for at least 3 years ahead of time. Unfortunately, the details are not published, so we don't actually know anything about it, but we know that they do it, we just don't know the contents. Suad, do you have?
Yeah, thank you, Trisha. I'm not sure if there are any international standards on pre-planning. Yeah, I'm sorry, we're not sure about that.
Okay, not to worry. Well, maybe what you can do is you can spend 2 minutes to each of you, which I can give you now, Suad, to go first, kind of wrapping up in terms of your thoughts and reflections on the various things that we've talked about this morning, and then to each of you will have time, and then I can summarize the whole discussion. All right, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Trisha. And thank you, colleagues, for giving us at IBP a chance to speak. We at IBP really strongly believe that open budgets are critical to support efficient resource allocation, better service delivery, greater trust in people, and leave no one behind. Transparency, we believe, is a right. It's a right for all citizens, and it may not be sufficient, but it is a necessary puzzle piece for the accountability ecosystem, along with strong oversight and participation. And for participation, I want to say that while we are piloting in a few countries, one of the projects at IBP is to pilot public participation in a few countries to see how it can be effective in the budgeting process. We understand that there is huge resource, sometimes for these processes to be meaningful, can be quite resource intensive. However, really there is value in thinking through some avenues, for example, service delivery related issues where you could connect the beneficiaries and make sure that the feedback is integrated into the budgeting process and into the allocation process. There is real value in doing that. We notice that in many countries, some process of this is happening and it's simply not integrated into the budgeting process. So there may be value in just reviewing the existing practices and ensuring that there is cross-sectoral collaboration and integration of these practices, and feedback loop goes into the budgeting process. That would be my 2 cents. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Suat, for your views. And Jeffrey, do you want to go next?
Yes. I think for a pre-planning process, I think it's very important to get a lot of different perspectives now, because things are so variable, so multidimensional, so multidisciplinary, and so many variables are floating around. So the assumptions, the list of assumptions before you draft a budget is very important. And I feel that there must be good public participation on that as well. But I think lastly, I feel that it's public participation and the critical mass that will help to create a good situation of good security and budget spending and all. Because if we rely on just the politicians, they are not able to stand up to the bureaucrats as well. But if there's a critical mass that understands it and demands for it, it makes it easier for our politicians to actually address the issue. So I feel that public participation, whoever is in power right now, should really work on getting involved the third sector, the public itself, the beneficiaries themselves. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And to Long Chen, and we also do have a last minute question to you. So you can respond to that in your summary. Does the government have enough budget to pay for, number one, the COVAX vaccine, number two, big projects like our ECRL, the East Coast Rail Link, and high-speed railway? So the big public infrastructure projects, do we have enough budget, basically?
I think the COVAX vaccine definitely will have the budget for it, because even if it costs like 3 billion or whatever the amount that is thrown around, it is so necessary that we spend it on that, right? Just to sustain and contain COVID-19. So I wouldn't worry too much about not having enough money for the vaccine. As for the suspension of the big projects, we have to look at the status of these projects. Sometimes it's already, if it's too advanced, it's better off just to finish it off, right? Just to complete it. If we haven't started, then let's prevent it. Yeah, some people would like to spend more on mega projects to get it to kickstart the economy, so to speak. We have to see whether that's true or not. Whether these contracts are, has issues of crony capitalism. Whether it's going to help China more, or is it going to help Malaysia more? Who are the contractors, the local contractors versus the foreign contractors? Who's going to benefit more? Those kind of things, cost-benefit study needs to come in and looked at, or at least exposed to people. And the government should take the position, whoever the next government is, should engage the people and say, look, this is really necessary or not. I can't say now at this moment, but I do know that ECRL is more or less like a white elephant for the price we're paying. So I do have concerns regarding this kind of thing. Now, let me conclude. I think it's very important for all the listeners and everybody out there to understand that we are in very strange situation. And therefore, when it comes to fiscal sustainability, all those concepts, all those preconditions we had have to be suspended for at least 2 years. Yeah. I'm not cheerleading this PN government to die or to crash. I'm just saying that this is a thing that all of us need to understand, and that they do need to borrow, but I want them to be transparent and accountable on that. We will support them if they survive to have more money. And there's no issue about it. Yeah. And I think you have to also rethink about the whole concept of national debt. Having debt, a government is not a corporation. Corporation is there to make money. A government is in fact supposed to be in deficit most of the time, every 1-2 years in a decade to have a surplus, right? So do not look at it too negatively. I think most economic thinking out there seems to suggest that we need to spend now. Yeah. So put that in context. Don't question about. Don't attack. Too much or blindly about the need of government to suspend sustainability and pursue a more expensive fiscal policy. Yeah. And lastly, they all say when it comes to crisis, there's opportunities. I think a responsible government needs to engage and take this opportunity to come clean. to take this situation and say, look, the opposition got to work with us. We've got to carry out what Suat has said, what Jeffrey has said, engage, inclusive, transparent. Because I think this crisis can actually turn out to be a good platform for unity, political unity, right? And as I said, there's no money to be stolen anyway, no silly money running around, so corruption and wastage should drop. It should drop, yeah? Now, again, political will, right? But the opportunity comes once in 100 years for a crisis that we face. That's the opportunity for us to bandy up together, unite, and change the way we do things. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to YB Wong Chen, Jeffrey Pang from IPJ, as well as Suat Hassan. Very aware that we're approaching midnight. So for you, Suat, thank you so much for being here with us. I think you've already summarized very well the discussion today. I just, make it really short in 3 bullet points. One, it's increasingly important for the government to remain transparent and accountable to its people, especially during times of crisis, when we need to know, okay, where the money is going to come from, how is this stimulus actually being financed, what are the long-term implications for our nation and the future generations, especially if it's going to increase our public debt further, but at the same time, understanding that government does need to spend as well, as what YB has said. So that's one. Second, I think it's very important then that access to information is available. I note that Suat is surprised that we do not yet have a Freedom of Information Act. We do have it at the state level, but only within 2 states. That's in Selangor and Penang, which not surprisingly actually are run by a government that's different from the federal. So we hopefully will see that happening in the future. Federal government should take that up as well and make information available by default, as opposed to having citizens apply for it, which is a rather painful process. And finally, that's where public participation comes in, where the public need to also demand for this information. And I think Jeffrey has done a really great job in using Petaling Jaya as a case study, but that's very urbanized, and we need to see more of that happening throughout the country as well. So I'd just like to make a couple of final announcements. So one is that we just like to thank Mari that has been supportive of today's webinar. And also please continue to follow our ideas, research and work. We are continuing to always constantly monitor things like the budget, stimulus package, and also the budget's coming out soon on the 6th of November. I think we're all going to be very busy looking at it, analyzing it, in terms of what the implications are for the following year. And finally, we have another webinar taking place next week on Thursday morning, and we're going to be talking about Orang Asli's access to education. So that's a very different thing altogether, but also related in terms of the vulnerable communities that require assistance within the country. So with that, it's 11:35 a.m. here in Malaysia. Thank you all for joining us this morning at this webinar on how transparent the 2021 budget will be. And all we will have to do now is wait for the 6th of November to know. Okay, goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.